You think you really know someone, don't you? I once believed I understood Clara completely, the woman I married, the one I pledged to build a life alongside. In the early months, everything felt like a beautiful dream. We had breakfast in bed, late-night movie marathons, and spontaneous road trips. We shared plans about children, the home of our dreams, and the vacations we would take together. Yet, somewhere down the line, I began to notice cracks in our seemingly perfect facade. At first, I was reluctant to acknowledge them. Who wants to face the reality that their ideal life might just be a fragile illusion waiting to collapse? It all started with small things. Initially, I thought I was simply overreacting. After all, that's how it goes in new marriages, right? Adjustments are just part of the package. But those little things accumulated quickly. One evening, I caught sight of Clara on the couch, engrossed in her phone. That wasn't out of the ordinary. She had always been attached to it. Yet, this time something felt off. The moment I entered the room, she quickly hid her phone under her leg, as if trying to conceal something. "What's going on?" I asked casually, striving to sound nonchalant. She looked up, presenting me with that forced smile I hadn't seen before we tied the knot. "It's just Nina." She waved her phone dismissively. "Work stuff." I nodded, playing along, but a nagging feeling persisted. Her gaze was too focused, her posture too defensive. Then, just like that, she got up and walked into another room. That was when it hit me, the first knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I was just being paranoid or simply tired. Yet that feeling lingered. A couple of weeks later, we attended a party at a mutual friend's house. I was attempting to be the easygoing husband, mingling with friends and trying to enjoy the evening. Clara looked stunning, as always, but something about her demeanor felt off. The way she carried herself and how her eyes darted around the room suggested she was searching for someone. I noticed it, but I convinced myself I was just imagining things. Then I spotted him, Ethan Cole. He wasn't a close friend of mine, more of an acquaintance. He was tall, well-groomed, and exuded way too much confidence for my liking. The way he smiled at Clara made my skin crawl. But it wasn't just him that bothered me. It was the way she responded to him. There was a light in her eyes that I hadn't seen in ages, not since the early days of our marriage. And then it happened. Ethan's hand brushed against hers. A fleeting touch, subtle enough that nobody else would catch it. But I noticed, and the worst part, she didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. I tried to remain composed, but my mind was racing. What the hell was happening? I felt like I was witnessing something unfold right before my eyes, like standing in a burning house while everyone else remained blissfully unaware of the flames. After the party, I decided to confront her, not outright, but enough to gauge her reaction. "So, Ethan, huh?" I said lightly as we drove home. She rolled her eyes and laughed, but it sounded forced. "What? Don't be ridiculous. He's just a friend. Just a friend. Isn't that always the go-to excuse?" That night, sleep eluded me. My thoughts kept replaying the scene at the party, her laughter, the way Ethan's hand had brushed hers, and that spark in her eyes. I needed to talk to someone, so I reached out to my friend Mason Blake the next day. Mason has always been the rational one, the voice of reason. "You're overthinking it, man," Mason said when I shared everything. "Everyone flirts a little. It's harmless. You've got to give her some space. People are stressed these days, especially with work and life piling up." I wanted to believe him. Oh, how desperately I wanted to believe him. I wished I could convince myself that I was just being paranoid and that Clara and I were still the same couple we used to be. But deep down, I felt something was terribly wrong. "You think so?" I asked, trying to sound reassured. Mason sighed. "Look, Cole, you love her. You two are still figuring things out. Don't go digging for problems where there aren't any. Just talk to her. Give her some time." So that's exactly what I did. I gave her space and time. In return, I got a wife who seemed to drift further away from me with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, nothing improved. Clara became increasingly distant and cold. Conversations that used to flow naturally turned awkward and stilted. She stopped laughing at my jokes and even stopped cuddling with me during our movie nights. Hell, She even started sleeping on the far edge of the bed, as if the few extra inches between us could mask the emotional chasm widening daily. Every time I attempted to address it, she shot me down. "You're overreacting," she'd snap, her voice laced with irritation. "Not everything is about you, Cole." And maybe she had a point. Perhaps it wasn't about me at all. But it sure as hell felt that way. One night, I reached my breaking point. She was on her phone again, typing away with that infuriating smile plastered on her face. I snapped. "Who the hell are you texting at 11 o'clock, Clara?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. Her head snapped up, and I could see her amusement turn to irritation in an instant. "Jesus, Collie. It's Nina. We've talked about this." "Then show me." Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something flicker across her face. Was it guilt or fear? But it vanished just as quickly. "You don't trust me," she whispered, her voice low and menacing. "No, I don't. Not with how you're acting." She shot up, her eyes blazing with anger. "You know what your problem is? You always think the worst of me. You can't stand the idea that maybe I'm not sitting here plotting against you. Maybe I just want some damn space." From there, the argument spiraled out of control, resurrecting old wounds and new insecurities. By the time it ended, we were both drained and furious. She stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, while I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, bewildered at how we had arrived at this point. That night, as I lay wide awake on the couch, a harsh realization settled over me. This wasn't merely a rough phase we were going through or the typical stress that accompanies married life. Something deeper was amiss between us. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, the truth was right there. Clara was slipping away one day at a time. The most painful part? I was utterly clueless about how to stop it. Following our argument, I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that every marriage goes through ups and downs, and this was just another one of those dreaded rough patches. Yet, that unsettling feeling gnawed at me relentlessly. It was present when I woke up, lingered through my workday, and crept back at night as I lay in bed, knowing she was just a few feet away but feeling like she was a complete stranger. I forced myself to act normal around her, hoping that if I played it cool, everything would eventually smooth out. But it was impossible to ignore how she avoided me, how her phone was always turned face down, or how she'd dart out of the room whenever I entered. I started to retreat emotionally. Engaging in conversations felt pointless since they always ended the same way, her accusing me of being controlling, while I felt like I was losing my sanity. I stopped trying to argue and simply withdrew. It was easier that way. Inside, though, the sense of betrayal festered. I kept telling myself to trust her, but every time I recalled that look she had given at the party, the one I'd seen when Ethan's hand brushed against hers, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. I couldn't shake the memory. Then, one night, Bree showed up unexpectedly at my door. I hadn't seen her in ages, and it felt surreal to find her standing there with a bottle of wine and a grin that suggested she knew just when to make an entrance. Bree always had a way of showing up at the right moment. She flashed me that knowing smile that made it seem like she could see right through my facade. "I figured you could use some company," she said, raising the wine. I didn't put up a fight. I stepped aside and let her in. We settled in the kitchen, sitting across from each other at the small table where Clara and I used to enjoy breakfast. Bree poured us each a glass of wine, leaned forward, and scrutinized me with her keen eyes. "Something's definitely off," she stated, bypassing any pretense. I let out a deep sigh, running a hand through my hair. "It's Clara. Things have been strange. She's so distant lately. I can't quite put my finger on it." Bree nodded, as if she'd anticipated this revelation. "You feel like she's drifting away." "Exactly," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "And I don't know what's causing it. I'm trying to make things work, but it's as if she's living in another world. It feels like she's not even present anymore." She reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I understand how hard that is. It's easy to drive yourself crazy, wondering if you're just imagining things. But you need to be certain before making any drastic moves. You can't accuse someone of wrongdoing without having solid proof. I stared down at my glass, swirling the wine like it could somehow provide clarity. I don't know, Bree. I'm not even sure what I'd accuse her of. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with concern. Let me help. Women tend to notice things that men overlook. If something's going on, we'll figure it out together. At first, I wanted to refuse. It felt wrong, like spying on my own wife would mean admitting I didn't trust her. But the truth was, I didn't trust her. Not anymore. Bree's offer was the lifeline I desperately needed, even if it made me loathe myself for accepting it. I agreed, and just like that, we were in this together, partners in uncovering whatever secrets lay hidden. We started by digging into Clara's social media accounts. Bree was relentless, meticulously scrolling through every post, every tagged photo, every comment. At first, we didn't uncover much, just a handful of old messages from Ethan, nothing explicitly incriminating. But they were enough to set my nerves on edge. She had been chatting with him even before we tied the knot, and although their conversations were vague and innocent, the timing was unsettling. Look at this, Bree said, pointing to one of the messages. This was sent 2 weeks before your wedding. She was already planting seeds with him. I tried to brush it off. That doesn't mean anything. People catch up with old friends all the time. Bree shot me a skeptical look that suggested she wasn't buying my excuse. Sure, but maybe she's been building something with him for a while, and you just didn't see it. That thought twisted my stomach into knots. I wanted to stop digging, but Bree wasn't ready to quit. She insisted we needed to delve deeper. If we want to get to the bottom of this, she said firmly, we have to see for ourselves. That's how I ended up sitting in a parked car outside Ethan's apartment a few nights later, Bree beside me. I felt like a total creep, sitting there with the engine off, observing the building like some kind of stalker. But I couldn't tear myself away. Bree's presence kept me anchored, oddly comforting. The first couple of nights passed without incident, just a few people coming and going with no sign of Clara. I began to think this whole operation was a mistake, that I was losing my mind chasing ghosts. But then, on the third night, everything changed. We were parked a block away, sipping coffee to stay awake when we saw Ethan's car pull up. And there she was, Clara, sliding out of the passenger seat, looking more relaxed than I had seen her in months. My chest constricted as I watched her lean in close, whispering something to Ethan that made him laugh. And then, without any hesitation, she followed him inside. For a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned bone white. Bree didn't speak at first. She simply placed a hand on my arm, grounding me. I think she understood that words would be useless at that moment. It felt like my entire world had just imploded, and I was powerless to stop it. I wanted to charge in, to drag Clara out and demand an explanation. But Bree held me back. Not yet, she whispered. You need all the evidence before confronting her. Otherwise, she'll twist it around and make you look like the villain. Bree was right, but that didn't ease my torment. As I sat in the car, staring at the darkened windows of the apartment building, a whirlwind of anger and humiliation surged within me. It was a fury I'd never experienced before, sharp and bitter, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Bree gently squeezed my arm. You'll have your moment, she whispered, but not like this. You need to play it smart. I nodded, even though every instinct urged me to confront them right then and there. Instead, I simmered in silence as the night wore on. I could feel something dark and dangerous shifting inside me. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about betrayal, about feeling foolish, and I refused to let it slide. Not this time. As I drove Bree home that night, the weight of what was happening settled over me. There was no turning back. Whatever came next, the life I had envisioned with Clara was over. The only question remaining was how far I was willing to go to make her pay for this. After that night parked outside Ethan's place, I was finished with pretense. There was no reverting to the way things used to be. I wasn't sure how I would confront Clara, but I knew it was inevitable. I just needed the right moment, the right evidence. Bree was right about one thing. If I approached Clara without proof, she'd twist the narrative, portraying me as the villain. She was skilled at that. Too skilled. I felt like I was hanging on by a thread, and Bree was the only person I could lean on. After hours of silence in that car, Bree placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, giving me a sympathetic look. "You can crash at my place tonight if you want," she offered. "There's no point in driving home in this state." I welcomed the idea. I didn't want to go back to my house. Not to the empty bed, not to the constant reminders of Clara. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I agreed. Bree lived just a few blocks away, and we drove in silence. Once inside, she kicked off her shoes and retrieved a bottle of wine from the kitchen. "Might as well drink, right?" she said with a tired smile. I nodded and followed her to the couch. The wine wasn't top shelf, but at that moment, anything that could dull the knot of anger and humiliation in my chest was welcome. We chatted for a while, the kind of conversation that filled the void more than it conveyed anything meaningful. We talked about life, about how marriage hadn't turned out to be what either of us expected. She vented about my dad, mentioning how he never really listened to her. I let slip a few things about Clara, more than I probably should have, but I didn't care. The wine was loosening me up, and the comfort of having someone to talk to felt too safe, too inviting. Somewhere between the third and fourth glass, the atmosphere shifted. I sensed it before it even happened, this subtle change in the way she regarded me. She leaned in closer, her hand brushing against mine. "You've really matured over the past few years," she murmured, her voice low and inviting. It was a simple statement, yet it felt monumental. I looked at her, truly looked, and realized how close we were sitting. Her perfume, the warmth radiating from her skin, everything about her was overwhelming in that moment. And I didn't pull away. I didn't stop it. Our eyes locked, and suddenly, the tension between us felt suffocating. It was as if all the emotions I'd buried, the anger, betrayal, and sorrow, were seeking an escape. And Bree was right there, close and familiar, offering something I hadn't felt in ages. Comfort, attention, and maybe a hint of desire. She placed her hand on my knee, a slow, deliberate gesture. I knew where this was headed. I recognized that I should stop it, but instead, I let it unfold. Her hand slid higher, and a wave of conflicting feelings washed over me. Something that blended fear with desire, guilt with relief. Just like that, the barriers between us crumbled. The kiss came suddenly, like a flame igniting. I tasted the wine on her lips, and before I realized it, we were intertwined on the couch, hands exploring each other, clothes coming off in a rush of heat and urgency. Bree whispered sweet, seductive words that made me forget, at least for a moment, about everything else. When she offered to go down on me, in that haze of wine and desperation, I didn't refuse. I let it happen, and then, without any thought of stopping, we were having sex. It was raw, reckless, and wrong in every conceivable way. But at that moment, it also felt liberating, like I was reclaiming something that Clara had taken from me. For a fleeting instant, I felt free. Free from the lies, the humiliation, and the burden of my crumbling marriage. But it wasn't that simple. As soon as it was over, guilt crashed over me like a tidal wave. I lay there, panting, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the reality of what I'd just done. Bree curled up beside me, tracing her fingers lightly over my chest as if this was completely normal. And maybe, to her, it was. Sleep evaded me that night. How could I possibly rest? I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and there was no turning back. Yet, what shocked me the most was how little I regretted it. Part of me recognized it was wrong, knew I had betrayed not only Clara but also my own father. But another part of me felt an unsettling sense of satisfaction, as if the scales had finally tipped in my favor. For once, Clara wasn't the only one breaking the rules. The next morning, Bree acted as if nothing had happened. She got up, brewed coffee, and smiled at me like we had just enjoyed a friendly chat the night before. "You can always count on me," she said, handing me a cup. There was no awkwardness or guilt on her part, just a casual acceptance of what had transpired. We didn't discuss it. We didn't need to. It was one of those unspoken agreements where both of us knew better than to bring it up. Whatever had occurred between us would remain buried. As I left her place, I felt numb, as if I were moving through someone else's life. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind. The sex, the fleeting liberation, and the overwhelming realization that I just complicated everything beyond repair. Upon walking through my front door, I found the house empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the barren living room, feeling like an outsider in my own life. There was no going back now. Everything had irrevocably changed. That morning after my encounter with Bree, I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd triggered a bomb that had yet to fully detonate. Guilt gnawed at me, but it was intertwined with something darker, more complex. I understood that my night with Bree wasn't merely a lapse in judgment. It was an act of revenge, a way to reclaim some of the control that had slipped through my fingers since I first suspected Clara was unfaithful. Yet now, the lines between right and wrong felt so blurred that I questioned which betrayal weighed heavier, mine or hers. Either way, I could no longer bear the weight of it. I needed to confront her. I needed the truth. I spent the entire day mentally rehearsing what I would say. But when Clara finally walked through the door that evening, all my carefully laid plans crumbled. She entered as if everything was perfectly normal, setting her purse down and scrolling through her phone like the world hadn't just imploded around us. I stood in the living room, watching her, my heart racing. This was it. No more pretending. "Clara," I said, my voice steady but laden with emotion. "We need to talk." She glanced up, an eyebrow raised. "What now, Cole?" I bit the inside of my cheek, fighting to maintain my composure. "You've been seeing Ethan." Her expression barely wavered. "What? No, I haven't." "Jesus, Cole, you're imagining things again." "I've seen the messages." I pulled my phone from my pocket and displayed the screenshots Bree and I had uncovered. "Don't lie to me." Her face tightened, a flicker of panic crossing her features before she plastered on that dismissive smile I'd come to despise. "That's nothing. Just some harmless flirting. It doesn't mean anything." "Cut the crap, Clara." My voice quivered with rage. "You've been sneaking around with him. I followed you. I saw you get out of his car and go into his apartment." For a brief moment, her facade shattered enough for me to glimpse the guilt lurking beneath. "So what if I did?" She shot back, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not like you've been Mr. Perfect. You've been distant and obsessed. You pushed me away." I could hardly believe my ears. "You're blaming me? You're the one who cheated." She shrugged, her tone icy and unapologetic. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It just happened." Her words struck me like a physical blow. I felt something inside snap, unleashing a wave of rage I could no longer contain. Before I knew it, I was grabbing her things. Clothes, shoes, anything I could find, and throwing them toward the door. "Get out," I growled. "Get the hell out of my house." She stared at me, momentarily stunned. Then her expression twisted into something bitter. "It was a mistake, okay? I wasn't thinking clearly. But you never really understood me." Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit, but I refused to show it. I stood there, breathing heavily, fists clenched at my sides as she grabbed her bag and stormed toward the door. She paused for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder one last time. "Good luck, Cole. You'll need it." And just like that, she was gone. I stood in the doorway, watching her fade into the night, feeling both empty and strangely relieved. I had been waiting for that moment, fantasizing about it, but now that it had happened, all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. Later that evening, Mason stopped by. I hadn't called him, but somehow, he knew I needed him. He walked in without a word, offering a sympathetic nod as he grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge. We sank into the couch in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. "Rough night, huh?" He finally broke the silence. "You have no idea," I muttered, taking a long swig of my beer. We talked about Clara and the fight, the messages, and the surveillance. But I couldn't bring myself to mention Bree. That part of the story felt too heavy, too perilous to share. Even with Mason, the guilt gnawed at me, but I buried it deep, convincing myself that some things were better left unspoken. The days that followed blurred together in a whirlwind of legal documents and bitter confrontations. Clara wanted a divorce and demanded her share of everything we had built together, despite being the one to shatter it all. The process was messy and draining, depleting what little energy I had left. Every interaction with her felt like reopening old wounds, and with each passing day, it became harder to remember why I had ever loved her in the first place. One night, a few weeks into the divorce proceedings, I ran into Ethan at a bar. I was nursing a drink, trying to forget everything for just a moment when I spotted him across the room. He caught my eye too, and instead of looking guilty or ashamed, the bastard smirked and raised his glass in a silent toast. Something inside me broke. I slammed my drink down on the bar and stormed across the room in 3 quick strides. My fists clenched at my sides. Before I could think twice, I grabbed Ethan by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You think this is a joke?" I growled, my voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You think you can just waltz in and take everything from me?" Ethan didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk deepened. "Clara's with me now," he taunted, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "Guess you weren't enough for her." That was the last straw. I swung without hesitation, my fist connecting with his jaw with a satisfying crack. He staggered back, but before I could charge at him again, the bartender and a couple of patrons restrained me, dragging me away. Ethan just stood there, laughing, wiping the blood from his lip while he reveled in my fury. "Take it easy, man," one of the guys holding me urged. "He's not worth it." Maybe they were right. Maybe none of this was worth the trouble. But in that moment, all I could see was red. All I wanted was to make him feel the pain I was drowning in. Eventually, they released me, and I stumbled out into the night, my knuckles throbbing and my heart racing. The cold air hit me like a slap, and as I stood on the sidewalk, the weight of my reality crashed down on me. My marriage was in ruins, my life was in tatters, and all I had left was the bitter satisfaction of having fought back, though it felt like a hollow victory. The divorce wasn't just a legal battle. It was the slow, agonizing unraveling of everything I thought I understood. The worst part? As I tried to pick up the pieces, the memory of that night with Bree lingered like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. No matter how hard I tried to erase it, it lurked in the shadows of my mind, a constant reminder that I wasn't innocent in this twisted mess. I had thought that confronting Clara would offer me closure. I believed it would free me from the chains of my despair. But the truth was that the damage ran too deep, and some wounds were beyond the reach of revenge. After the divorce, I found myself back at my father's house. Moving in with Victor felt like surrender, like sealing the coffin on the life I had envisioned for myself. The house was unchanged, yet it felt foreign, stripped of its familiarity. To complicate matters, Bree was still around, acting as if nothing had shifted between us. The night we shared was a secret I bore like an anchor around my neck. It weighed heavily on me, yet I felt inexplicably drawn to her, a pull I couldn't fully comprehend. I hated myself for it, but thoughts of her haunted me. Every time we crossed paths in the kitchen or brushed shoulders in the hall, a heavy tension enveloped us. We didn't discuss what had happened. We didn't need to. The memory loomed between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the chaos we had created. Yet, somehow, despite everything, I kept getting pulled deeper into it. Bree had a way of making me feel seen, something I hadn't experienced in ages, not with Clara, not with anyone. But those feelings were tangled in guilt and shame, creating a trap I couldn't seem to escape. Months slipped by in this strange limbo, where I pretended everything was normal while the ghost of that night loomed large. Then, one evening, Bree knocked on my door. When she walked in, she looked nervous, more anxious than I had ever seen her. I sensed that something significant was about to unfold. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I'm pregnant."
Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, my mind racing, struggling to wrap my head around what she had just said. Pregnant. She was pregnant. And the worst part? We both knew that baby could very well be mine. She sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands as if searching for the right words. "We can't tell Victor." "Not yet." I nodded, though every instinct screamed that this was a disaster waiting to unfold. Keeping a secret like this felt like carrying a ticking time bomb in my pocket. It was only a matter of time before it detonated, leaving chaos in its wake. At first, Victor remained oblivious. But as the weeks dragged on, he began to notice the changes. Bree's peculiar behavior, her mood swings, how she suddenly avoided drinking during family dinners. He wasn't a fool. He sensed that something was amiss, and it wouldn't be long before his suspicions pointed directly at me. One evening, during a family dinner, Victor dropped the bombshell. "What's going on between you two?" His gaze pinned me in place, unyielding and intense. I know something happened. I felt my heart drop. Bree avoided eye contact, staring down at her plate as if it could swallow her whole. Her silence was all the confirmation Victor needed. Slowly, he rose, fury radiating from him like heat from a flame. "Don't lie to me," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Did you sleep with her?" I tried to deny it, but the words felt like lead in my throat. "Nothing happened," I muttered, though I knew he saw through the lie. Victor's jaw tightened, and before I could brace myself, he lunged at me. His fist collided with my face, sending me crashing back against the wall. In an instant, we were locked in a chaotic struggle, shoving, grappling, fists flying in a blur of anger and betrayal. Years of unresolved resentment surged to the surface, and we fought like men whose histories were laden with pain. "Tell me the truth," he shouted, pinning me against the wall. Bree finally broke her silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "The baby, it might not be yours, Victor." Time froze. Victor stepped back, disbelief etched across his features. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, the air thick with the weight of her confession. Then, without another word, Victor turned and stormed out, leaving us both in stunned silence. The following days morphed into a blur of tension and sorrow. Victor filed for divorce, packed his things, and left without a single goodbye. He even served me with a legal notice, demanding I vacate the house within 30 days. I was suddenly homeless, jobless, and completely devoid of options. I ended up crashing on Mason's couch, too ashamed to reach out to anyone else. Mason did his best to be there for me, but there was little he could do to help me escape this downward spiral. Losing Clara was one thing. Losing my father on top of that was a crushing blow. It felt like the ground beneath me had split open, and I was plummeting into a void with no hope of recovery. Depression hit me like a freight train. I stopped responding to texts, stopped going out, stopped caring about anything. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, drinking excessively, and wondering how my life had devolved into this nightmare. There were nights when the darkness felt so oppressive that I struggled to breathe. I even contemplated ending it all, of fading away quietly, leaving behind the wreckage of my life. But Mason wasn't about to let me slip away that easily. One night, after he pried a nearly empty bottle of whiskey from my hands, he sat me down and said, "You can't keep doing this, man. You need to talk to your dad. At least try to make things right." At first, I resisted. What was the point? Victor despised me. But Mason persisted, and eventually, I relented. I reached out, sent a text, and was surprised when Victor agreed to meet. We chose a small cafe, both of us awkward and tense as we sat across from each other. I could sense the anger simmering just beneath his calm facade, but there was also a flicker of something that looked like regret. "I can't forgive you," he said, stirring his coffee absently without meeting my gaze. "Not completely, but maybe we can start fresh. Try to rebuild something." It wasn't the reconciliation I'd envisioned, but it was more than I deserved. We lingered in that space, talking about everything and nothing, both acutely aware that things would never return to what they once were. Yet it felt like a start. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow process of piecing my life back together. It wasn't easy. The weight of my past clung to me like a suffocating shroud, and there were days when I felt like I'd never escape its grasp. But then, one day I met someone new. Her name was Maya, and she was a breath of fresh air, nothing like Clara or Bree. She was kind, patient, and exactly what I didn't realize I needed. We spent countless hours together, sharing stories about our lives, our aspirations, and the struggles we'd faced. With her, there were no games, no betrayals, just a beautiful honesty that felt refreshing. One evening, we found ourselves on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The mistakes, the heartbreak, the chaos, they were still part of me, but they no longer defined my existence. As the sun sank lower, Maya took my hand, and in that moment, I realized that life, no matter how fractured, continues to move forward. There's always a way out of the darkness, even when everything feels like it's crumbled to dust. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new and beautiful.